Hold on to your butts.
Da-da-da. You were saying?
Welcome to episode 160 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. Tonight, as always, I'm joined by Darren Weeks, the most awesome Civil War nerd I know. Again, he asked me to do the intro, and again, I'm sure I've not done a great job as usual, but he insists I do these every other episode. And you can probably hear him clapping.
Bravo, bravo.
I tried.
I
also have a head cold too.
Oh, that's right. You're going into the light anyway. So how are you doing, Mary? What's going on?
I don't have a man cold.
On this lovely Friday cold evening here in Gettysburg. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm good other than the head cold.
Okay, that's fine.
How about you?
Oh, things are going great. It's a week before Christmas. Things are good. And we are recording again. This will be our final episode of 2025 in 160 if you're keeping track. And that's and we're going to have a lot of fun with this one.
We are, and I'm excited to record this one. It's not one that is set in the Civil War, but it has to do with the Civil War in many, many ways.
We will get to that.
And before we get to that, though, what are you drinking?
Oh, my God. Thank you so much. I'm just going old school, Mary. We're drinking good old Yingling here, and I'm drinking it out of my Abraham Lincoln mug because I don't really have anything specific. I had a John Brown mug, but I can't seem to find it.
Oh, maybe Santa will bring you one.
Probably not. Anyway, but what about yourself? What are you drinking?
I am just having something that I'm sure only Stonewall Jackson would appreciate, which is water with lemon. I'm being really boring tonight. But
oh, well, that's okay.
Again, not feeling the greatest.
Not the first time, but anyway. But as you hinted at, Mary, is tonight we're going to go way back before the Civil War to talk about an event that is arguably one of the most important flashpoints that ultimately resulted in the American Civil War. The Pottawatomie Massacre that took place near Pottawatomie, Kansas during the Bleeding Kansas era of 1856. Now, before we get into it, fair warning, we are going to talk about John Brown.
We are.
We aren't going to discuss whether his actions were right, whether they were wrong. There's probably no more polarizing person, maybe in all of American history, than Brown. So we're going to channel our inner Joe Friday here, Mary, from the old Dragnet TV show. We're going to talk just the facts, ma'am. And people can make up their own minds about his legacy. And that's not for our job to do this.
It's, as you said, he's very polarizing. And two, but he is a figure that in the history of the Civil War, he needs to be studied. What he does needs to be studied because it is important into the lead up of the Civil War. And it is one of the events that is part of that lead up.
Right. So a lot of people talk about Reconstruction. We're going to talk about pre-destruction, which is lead up to the Civil War. But before we get going into the story of the massacre, it's important to go back in the Wayback Machine and talk about how they kind of got there. Now, the abolitionist movement in the early to mid 1800s was growing, but still, for the most part, it was focused in New England, specifically the great city of Boston. It was fueled by people like, William Lloyd Harrison, David and Mariah Child, Margaret Fuller. The goal of abolition was to be achieved by peaceful means. Now, Garrison was a non-resistor. Like when we did the episode on the Amish and the Mennonites, it was same kind of cut from the same cloth. He was a non-resistor to the point where one time he was beaten and dragged from a carriage one day in downtown Boston, and he refused to even defend himself. I assume he had a Yankee hat on. But Garrison began a newsletter that he called The Liberator that slowly gained popularity and soon began to see subscriptions from the Deep South, deep behind slave-holding territories. And it got to the point where even possession of a copy of The Liberator meant instant arrest, and eventually bounties were placed on Garrison's head by those who wanted to take him to the South and try him for treason. Now, though the Garrisonian abolitionists in New England basically demanded pacifism, not all abolitionists believed peace was necessary means to an end. Even in Massachusetts, the transcendentalists, guys like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, they believed that the end of slavery would only come from the spilling of blood. Yep. One abolitionist who would come around to this reality was a New Englander from Torrington, Connecticut, named John Brown.
Yep. And he was born on May 19th, 1800. He's the son of Owen Brown and Ruth Mills. His grandfather died in the Revolutionary War in New York on September 3rd in 1776. Now, Brown said his parents were poor, but his dad did become a leading and wealthy citizen once they moved to Hudson, Ohio, which they did in 1805 when John was at the age of 5. At this point, this area of Ohio is mainly wilderness and part of what was called the Western Reserve. So this was land that was claimed by Connecticut, but it was mostly Northeast Ohio. And this region is very anti-slavery. So even at a young age, John Brown is moving into an area that is very anti-slavery, which obviously is going to influence him later in life. Another thing about Brown is his father, Owen, is also very anti-slavery.
Right.
One interesting connection that I found is Brown's father operated a tannery. And at that tannery, he employed Jesse Grant, General Ulysses S. Grant's father. And Jesse actually lived with the Brown family for a few years. Mm-hmm. So that was an interesting Civil War connection I found. One other thing, too, about Hudson, Ohio, is the founder of that town was an abolitionist, and he was an advocate of forcible resistance by slaves. And Owen, John Brown's father, had frequent contact with him. And one can assume, as I said before, that he may have had an influence upon him.
Yeah, I mean, Brown believe it or not, he was a Garrisonian pacifist early in his life, but as time went on, he slowly became radicalized to the point where he felt violence was the only way to an end what he called, quote, the sin of slavery. And we'll get back to his bio in a second, but Brown would write that he, quote, felt the stirrings of his eternal war with slavery at age 12. He wrote a letter to a fellow 12-year-old at the time named Henry Stearns, who was the son of George Stearns, who happened to be later on become a member of the Secret Six. And we'll talk about them down the road. But he described seeing a slave beaten with a shovel. And he was also, like you said, influenced by his deeply religious abolitionist father, Owen. Now, Owen, he was a devout Calvinist, and he had that intense belief in universal human rights. And he raised John with those strong religious and abolitionist values. And like you said, they moved to Hudson, Ohio. They'll end up in Akron down the road. Yeah. But he would help fugitive slaves escape via the Underground Railroad.
Yeah, he offered a safe house as part of it. And Owen, his father, is also going to participate in anti-slavery debate. And he's also a supporter of Oberlin College, which is one of the first colleges in the United States to admit African Americans. And in 1837, they were one of the first to admit women.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when John began to follow suit, began to run away with slaves, like you said before, but John is going to meet and marry his first wife, her woman named Diantha Lusk. And in 1825, they're going to move to Richmond Township in northwest Pennsylvania, which is about a quarter mile from the Pennsylvania-Ohio Canal, with their 3 sons. Now, their family expanded to 6 children before too long, so clearly there wasn't much to do in northwest Pennsylvania besides, playing with John Brown's body, right? But there, like you said, Brown built a tannery, which became a stop on the Underground Railroad, and he saw over 2,500 runaway slaves stop there to his escape. Now, Brown, like his father, was a strict Calvinist, and he was particularly hard on his children.
Oh, he was, and he to the point where I think it was his son one day had a dream that he had a pet raccoon, and he told his dad about it, and then John lashed him for it. His daughter one day lied about how she'd lost her shoes. She was out gathering flowers and she lost them in a creek. But as much as he was that way, and that's how the Calvinists were, his children would say that he was also a very doting father who was kind to them. And another thing to mention about Brown, too, is he does have tragedy early in his life. His mom died at the age of 8, giving birth to a baby girl who also died. And John would mourn his mother for years. And this is a pattern with John Brown. When he loses somebody in his life that he's close to, he mourns them. He takes it very, very hard.
He does. He's enigmatic. But going back to his discipline, I mean, he would whip his kids.
Yeah.
I mean, he would give 3 lashes for laziness during work, 8 for disobeying their mother and father. I mean, I would have lasted 5 seconds in the Brown household. And you mentioned Brown's second son, Jason, with the raccoon.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Not only did he punish his kids in this manner, he made each of his kids keep a journal detailing their sins after each occurrence. There's a diary for you.
It was just so... I don't know, we're so far from that in our society today now, but and then to hear how he's but he's also he could be kind and caring, and he paid attention to his kids, and he was nice to them and all this other stuff. But it was just it was such a different time back then.
Yeah, I mean, 1832, his wife Diantha is going to basically suffer from mental illness, and she'll die after she gave birth to a stillborn, which left John, like you said, in complete shock. He said afterwards, quote, "I have been growing numb for a good while, and I am getting more and more unfit for anything."
Well, it was the same thing that happened to his mother. His mother died when she gave birth to a stillborn as well.
Yeah. So now John's a single father of 5 kids. He's struggling financially as a tanner. He had to hire a 16-year-old housekeeper named Mary Ann Day. Naturally, within a year, Brown marries her, despite being 16 years older than her and her being just 4 years older than John's oldest son, John Jr.
When I read that, I was like, what?
Well, they're going to have an astonishing 13 kids together. And it makes you wonder if this guy ever actually wore pants.
I know, I was thinking that too. It's like, what is he doing?
He was great at having kids, but awful at managing money. He was always out of money. He blamed everyone but himself for his business failings as a tanner.
Did he get a bad number on a loan?
He probably got a bad Yelp review. That's probably what it was. But he was also helping escape slaves at his property too. Now remember, at this point, he's still a pacifist. And throughout the 1830s, Brown began to write about his determination to help slaves and end what he called the sin of slavery. He joined the Freemasons, but quit the fraternity not long after he learned about the Morgan Affair, which was about a Mason named William Morgan in Batavia, New York, who was killed by Freemasons in 1826 after threatening to publish secrets of the fraternity. So he was so disinterred by their violence that he got away from it. Garrisonian abolitionists again maintained that firm non-resistance, which to the point where they refused to take part in the government. But around this point, John, he was moving mentally a little bit, and he bought his first gun at this point, which was a surprise. Now, the concept of peaceful abolition was really thrown on its head in 1831 when a preacher slave named Nat Turner led a group of slaves to a rebellion in Southampton City, Virginia, in August of 1831, which resulted in the killings of white men, women, and children, including an infant who was killed in his cradle with an axe. Nat Turner's rebellion stirred up that deep, visceral fear from whites in the South who always feared being killed in their beds by rebelling slaves. But what Turner did was galvanize the Boston abolitionists who now wanted immediate abolition of all slaves versus that concept that Thomas Jefferson had of letting it die out on its own that he figured was going to happen.
Yep.
In his Liberator newsletter, Garrison wrote, quote, "Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." So, and the reason why I'm talking about Turner's rebellion is because it led to a crackdown on slaves. It created tighter slave hunting patrols, and it made abolitionists clear enemies, which they accused of inciting slaves into rebellion. So what you're seeing is a different attitude, the North and South, and vice versa. Turner's rebellion also fired up Brown and really gave the abolitionist movement steam, and by 1833, the American Anti-Slave Society was created by Garrison. But what it did too is it created a schism in that pacifist philosophy of Garrison, as many at this point didn't see a peaceful end as being all that realistic.
And I think that's when Brown begins to realize there will be no peaceful end to this.
Yeah, I mean, Brownie's born a Quaker. He hated all things military. He talked about seeing soldiers in the War of 1812, and he hated them. But he began to veer off of pacifism. He went to Boston to meet with Garrison in the Boston Clique, which is what they called Garrison's people. And he got into a heated argument with him over the true way to end slavery. Garrison was a New Testament guy of resistance, not evil, turn the other cheek. Brown was an Old Testament guy of an eye for an eye. The next event that's going to help evolve Brown's changing commitment to violence, over pacifism, occurred on November 7th, 1837 in Alton, Illinois. An abolitionist minister named Elijah Lovejoy, he created a newspaper in St. Louis, Missouri, which was a slave state, where abolition wasn't protected by the First Amendment because it was considered inflammatory. Due to pro-slavery mob threats, he moved to Alton, Illinois. On November 7th, 1837, a pro-slavery mob burned his warehouse that held all of his anti-slavery materials. They destroyed his printing press. They threw it into the Mississippi River. Now, Lovejoy, who was an abolitionist, but he was not a pacifist.
Yeah.
He tried to defend himself with a rifle and actually shot one of the pro-slavery mob. In response, the mob fired on Lovejoy, hitting him 5 times in the chest, killing him instantly. Now, Lovejoy's death, and a lot of people don't study this part of history, but his death stunned the North to its core. John Quincy Adams, former president and the U.S. rep from Massachusetts, said at the time of it, quote, "The murder gave shock as an earthquake throughout the country."
Yep.
Abolitionists in Boston, that Boston clique, they compared Lovejoy's death to the shot fired in Lexington on April 19th of 1775.
Yeah. And this is where John Brown is going to publicly declare after the incident, "Here, before God, in the presence of these witnesses, from this time, I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery."
And it's important to go back this far back before we get to this massacre because you have a clear changing mentality with Brown. And at events that we're going to talk about here, every event that happened drove him further and further into radicalism. Now, Lovejoy became a martyr, and Brown decided to create his own abolitionist society, which was his family, his wife Mary Ann, and his 3 teenage sons, John Jr., Jason, and Owen. He made them take a secret oath while on their knees, which said, quote, "Are you willing to make common sense cause with me in doing all in your power, to break the jaws of the wicked and pluck the spoil out of his teeth?" Right? So by then, the Browns had moved back to Ohio, where the economic depression of 1837 left them broke. In 1840, Brown is going to be arrested when he refused to leave his home after he was foreclosed on. The Browns' world was shaken again even worse in 1843, when a cholera epidemic swept through the house. In over 4 consecutive days in September, 4 of Brown's children died: Charlie, Peter, Austin, and Sarah, all under 10 years old, each day consecutively.
And they were all buried in the same grave.
They were. He wrote of it, quote, "I felt for a number of years a steady and strong desire to die."
Yeah, and you have to wonder if he's focusing on this. So clearly today, he likely would have been diagnosed with depression. But, and yes, he's had a lot of tragedy in his life from, age of 8 when his mom dies, and then his first wife passing away because of a stillborn, and then these 4 children. And he's finding now something. He's also being radicalized in this, in becoming in being an abolitionist, and he's taking it very, very far. And he must have felt that was something that he's like, well, I can focus on this. This is what I can do.
Well,
you have to remember if this,
focus on, yeah.
Even this event, though it's not at all related to slavery or abolition, this event of his 4 children passing away is just tipping him even further into that radicalization.
Yeah, exactly. Later in 1847, Brown is going to move to Springfield, Massachusetts to work with textiles. Ironically, it's the town that housed the nation's first armory. And it was a town full of free blacks. There he's going to meet an escaped slave turned abolitionist speaker named Frederick Douglass, who was also visiting along with William Lloyd Garrison. And here's where they had that famous photo taken by Augustus Washington, the one where his right hand is up, and he's holding a banner in his left hand called SPW, which is a subterranean passageway, which was the name of his scheme for slave liberation. Now, Brown he met with Douglass and told him of his idea to help end slavery. This idea is going to kind of knock him on his butt a little bit. Brown wanted to use the Allegheny Mountains as a base for his guerrilla army, which he would raid towns in Virginia and then run off with their slaves. He said he wanted to make slave owners feel unsafe and insecure, basically feeding off of those fears that existed from Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831.
And he referred to it as going to Africa. Whenever he says Africa, he means South, specifically Virginia.
Right, exactly. Now, Douglass, he's a pacifist. He's Garrisonian. He had his "are you kidding me" face on when he heard this. He was mortified. But he wrote about it afterwards. This is Douglass now, and he says, quote, "Brown is in sympathy and is deeply interested in our cause, as though his own soul had been pierced from slavery." So basically what Brown was doing, he was talking about basically becoming a terrorist. He wanted to spread fear and incite a rebellion. Now, Brown's plan changed when he met a guy named Garrett Smith. He's a future Secret Six member who is a rich abolitionist from Utica, New York, or as you say, Utica, right?
I don't say Utica.
Anyway, Smith offered Brown the opportunity to buy 244 acres of land in North Elba, New York, which is just outside of Lake Placid, where Smith had created basically an opportunity for blacks to live and learn to farm. He thought that if they owned land, they would be enfranchised to vote eventually, so that was kind of his grand plan. Smith was the only member of the Secret Six, not from Boston, by the way. He was from...
Interesting.
Anyway, so Brown would basically buy 244 acres for $1 an acre, and Smith said, you can pay me whenever. I don't think he ever got paid for it, by the way. But Brown asked if he could help educate these blacks who are on the farm so they could be self-sustaining and eventually become landowners, which Smith is like, sure, absolutely. But this is when Brown's temperament kind of cooled a little bit during this period, as he and his family lived in North Elba, and he spent his time, educating blacks in the area how to farm, how to live by themselves. But across the country at this time, to quote Bob Dylan, Mary, times they were a-changing, right? And this is going to affect the future of slavery in the West. This debate, you can track these back, and we talked about it the other night at our roundtable. The debate began really when Texas was annexed in 1845, but ramped up after the Mexican War of 48 and the California Gold Rush in 1849. What you had was rapid expansion west, and it brought the slavery debate to a boil over the question of whether new territories would be free or slave labor, and also if settlers could bring their slaves into these new territories. Now remember, up to this point, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 specified that slavery was banned for remaining lands north of the 36th and 30th parallel. Basically a line running from the Missouri-Arkansas border. We talked about the Prairie Grove battle last week.
Yeah, we did an episode, it was, I can say years ago now, because we've been doing this for 5 years. We did an episode that talked about the Missouri Compromise. Yeah,
and this line basically in your mind, it ran the Missouri-Arkansas border, ran west, north of modern-day Oklahoma, straight through to basically California. But the need for more slave land was becoming important because what does cotton do? It destroys the soil. And as cotton was getting more and more important as an export,
they needed
land. 1850, President Millard Fillmore said of slavery, quote, "We must endure it and give it much protection as is guaranteed by the Constitution." Now, Northern abolitionists, again, as you can imagine, they feared, as did whites in these new territories, that slave labor was going to be in competition for free labor, and their status, again, is going to be diminished. 1850, the U.S. Congress, what they usually do, come up with great ideas, Mary. They sought a new compromise, and it came up with California would be entered as a free state, while two territories, basically Utah and New Mexico, would be open to slavery. But here's the deal. To help sweeten this deal for the South to vote for this, they agreed to strengthen the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens to aid in the capture and return of escaped slaves anywhere in the North. As you can imagine, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act set off protests in the North, especially in abolitionist Boston. Harriet Beecher Stowe, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which further fired up the North against slavery, including John Brown. So now Brown, who'd been kind of chilling and cooled off a little bit, now he's getting fired up again. Brown's back in Springfield, Mass. At this time, and he was enraged, as a lot of people were. He created a group of 44 men, mostly blacks, and called them the Gileadites.
And they were strong-minded, brave, and dedicated.
He said of them, quote, "Stand by one another and by your friends while a drop of blood remains, and to be hanged, if you must, but tell no tales out of school." So this 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, again, began Brown's path towards violent actions versus violent words. And he targeted anyone pro-slavery who were basically getting rich off of cotton in the South. Because remember, too, he can't handle money. He's been foreclosed on. He doesn't have a pot to piss in financially. And he hates slavery, and he sees these people in the South making all this money off of slaves. So you can imagine. Now, expansion was all the rage in the early 1850s. Mississippi Senator, a guy named Jefferson Davis, Mary, perhaps you've heard of him. He wanted to annex Cuba. in the entire Yucatan Peninsula.
I know the quote you're going to say.
Oh, yeah. Well, the Albert Brown quote?
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Fellow Mississippi Senator Albert Brown wanted to take all of Central America, and DQ wanted to open stores throughout Las Vegas. I mean, the expansion was going crazy. Albert Brown wrote, here's that quote, "I want these countries for the spread of slavery. I would spread the blessings of slavery like the religion of our divine master to the utmost ends of the earth." Quotes like this heighten the anxiety and the insecurity in the North. So now the Northern press is going to get involved. New York Tribune's Horace Greeley, he wrote, quote, "Slavery loves aggression. It is a leper of modern civilization, but a leper who no cry of unclean will keep it for intrusion into uninfected company." And I mention all this because this was the world John Brown was living in at this time, and how much his march into radicalism was being guided by fear and anger being fed by politicians and newspapers.
Yeah, and I think the other fear too is not just for the abolitionists with that slavery is going to continue expanding, but the thought of going into Cuba or South America, wherever they wanted to do, that means annexation. That means war.
Well, they'd already been there with Mexico.
Yeah, but that's the thing is these they're probably like, we don't want any more war at all. Like,
well, who knows? I mean,
but that's what I mean. It's like if they're going to do
that's a whole other episode about all that stuff.
Yeah.
But in 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois introduced a bill to open the area where modern-day Kansas and Nebraska are, as well as 6 other western states. All this territory was north of the 36th 30th parallel, and per the Missouri Compromise, was prohibited from slavery. Douglas needed support for this, so to get Southern support for the act, which will be called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Douglas agreed to include in his new bill the repeal of the 1820 Missouri Compromise. So this act allowed the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to allow inhabitants of these territories to vote to determine if they would be free or eligible for slavery. President Franklin Pierce signed this act into law in May of 1854. Now, back in Boston again, William Lloyd Garrison exploded in a rage upon hearing this news. And on July 4th, 1854, Garrison actually burned a copy of the U.S. Constitution, calling it, quote, "a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. So perish all compromises with tyranny." So much for Garrison non-resistance, right?
Even he's getting angry.
Well, again, you can see exactly where this is going now. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was the gas that was thrown on the simmering flame. It meant the future of slavery versus freedom in Kansas is going to be determined now by a vote, and predictably what happens. People from both sides begin to flock to Kansas.
Yep.
So by the fall of 1854, 5 of John Brown's sons had moved to Kansas to help defend free state settlers against pro-slavery men who were coming into Kansas from Missouri, called ruffians.
Yeah, and it was the sons that moved were John Jr., Jason, Owen, Frederick, and Salmon.
John Brown, again, he considered going back to Kansas, but decided to remain in North Elba to help the blacks in the area. Also, his wife Mary Ann was pregnant again, because of course she was, and he didn't want to move her. She was 8 months pregnant at the time, and, when they were going to go to Kansas, and didn't want to move her all the way across. He did write, quote, "I am disposed to go to Kansas or Nebraska to help defeat Satan," in all capital letters, "and his legion," and he actually debated internally to go or to stay. His sons wanted their father to go and join them very badly. In May of 1855, John Jr., he wrote to him to tell him of this Missouri ruffians, the fraudulent elections going on, and overall corruption and intimidation by this well-armed pro-slavery supporter group in Kansas. He also said the Free State supporters were weak cowards and had no weapons to defend themselves. He said, basically, we need arms, we need organization quickly, or Kansas would be lost. He wrote to his father, this is from his letter, he wrote, quote, "Every slave-holding state is furnishing money and men to fasten slavery upon the glorious land by means no matter have foul." So what's he doing? He's putting out the John Brown bat signal here.
Yeah.
Because and it's not really true, because at that point, there was really no real violence in Kansas. There was intimidation and there was fraudulent elections. But John is presenting a story of dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria here, which didn't really exist. The Brown sons and their families had staked a claim of land near a small Kansas town of Pottawatomie, right? Now, I mentioned the voter fraud before I forget about this. The voter fraud was true. In the 1855 census, the area reported 2,905 eligible voters. In the elections they had in March of that year, the pro-slavery field won by 5,427 votes. So obviously there's stuff in the ballot box.
There's stuff going on, obviously.
He was also being honest, John Jr., about the militia. By late spring of 1855, there were rumors of a pro-slavery army was massing on the Missouri border ready to invade Kansas. John Jr. wrote one final letter to coax his dad to come, and it said, quote, "Every day strengthens my belief that the sword will soon be called upon to give its final verdict." So John's getting these letters. He's hearing everything going on. He's also looking at the fact that his 5 sons and their families are there and exposed. So he had enough. He decided that he was going to pick up and he needed to join his sons in Kansas. So in June of 1855, he packed his wife and their 4 remaining kids, and they're going to go to Kansas. Now, first they're going to go to Syracuse to a convention of radical abolitionists to let them know what he was hearing from his sons. He wanted lawyers, guns, and money, right? Well, mostly money and guns.
Lawyers, guns.
He wanted to raise money and he needed weapons. So in Syracuse, he's going to meet with Frederick Douglass again, as well as Garrett Smith, the guy who sold him the land for North Elba. He was only able to raise $60. That's it. He then went to Ohio to see his father, Owen, who gave him an additional $40. And he was also able to acquire a handful of weapons. On the way, he's going to pick up the body of his 4-year-old grandson.
Yeah.
And he's going to bring that, and he's going to finally make it to Kansas in October of 1855 with his family as well as his son-in-law, a guy named Henry Thompson. Again, this was a miserable trip. They were cold. They were sick. I mean, it
was a terrible trip. By the time that they got to Kansas, I think they had like 12 cents left or something.
They had $60 left.
That's it.
That's the
wow.
I mean, it's $60 still pretty. Yeah. But John Brown, like Jake and Elwood Blues, he felt he was on a mission from God. Literally. That's what he was thinking. All these recent events we talked about, the Elijah Lovejoy killing, the annexation of Texas, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and now this Kansas-Nebraska Act, they took a toll and brought Brown closer to radicalizing. Easy for me to say. From a pacifist to someone who felt that he was on a mission to end slavery, Old Testament style, and he was preordained and put on earth to do it.
Yeah.
So when he arrived in Kansas, he learned that fraudulent election, that pro-slavery legislature, had put into law threatening 2 years in prison for anybody protesting slavery and 10 years if they violated the Fugitive Slave Act. Local pro-slavery newspapers also threatened any abolitionists found in Kansas, and they wrote, quote, "We will continue to tar and feather, drown, lynch, and hang every white-livered abolitionist who does pollute our soil." Okay. Free state settlers scheduled their own elections on October 9th, 2 days after Brown's arrival. And border ruffians had disrupted previous elections, so when Brown arrived, first thing he does, he's going to pack his wagon full of weapons, and they're going to go to the voting precinct in Pottawatomie looking for a fight. But you know what happens? No ruffians show up. He was disappointed. But basically at this time, you had 2 opposing militias in Kansas staring each other down, sizing each other up for a fight that was finally going to come. And finally what happened on November 21st, 1855, they hit that flashpoint. A pro-slavery settler named Franklin Coleman, he shot and killed a free state settler named Charles Dow near Lawrence, Kansas. And he created a standoff between 1,500 men that would be known later as the Wakarusa War. And John Brown and his sons, they went to Lawrence. They had their wagon again loaded with weapons. And they got there on December 6th. But when they arrived, they met with a newspaper editor named George Washington Brown, no relation. And they went to the Free State Hotel, where peace negotiations were happening. So this Wakarusa War wasn't much of a war, but Charles Robinson, who was the leader of the Free State Kansas movement, and the governor of Kansas's shadow government, which is based in Topeka, they're going to meet with Kansas and pro-slavery Governor Wilson Shannon. And they're going to try to get together and just kind of settle this whole thing peacefully. Yeah. You have two governments who think they control the state, and it's a natural war waiting to happen. Robinson, after meeting with John Brown, gave him the title of captain of the 1st Brigade of Kansas Volunteers, which is really just an honorary title.
Yeah, he's not like an actual captain.
It wasn't. From this point on, he referred to himself as Captain John Brown. There is no truth to the rumor. He called himself the good captain on social media. Just saying. But even though he called himself a captain, he wrote later, quote, "Me and God are the only commanders of my sons." So he's got this title in his head, but he thinks...
He feels he's being, at this point now, he feels he is being led by God and that he's been chosen by him as well to do this.
Exactly. But during this is where you can see the difference in Brown's mindset now. During these peace negotiations at the hotel, right, like with Shannon and with Washington Brown, Brown approached Charles Robinson and told him, "Hey, I have an idea. Hear me out. Here's what I want to do." Now, this is during peace negotiations. He goes, "How about you let me sneak into the pro-slavery militia camp and slaughter them all while they're sleeping?" That's what he proposed. So Robinson, who again is trying to negotiate peace, has a "are you kidding me" face, and told him, "No, we're trying to negotiate a peace deal here, and there's nothing that's been done to condone a massacre, let alone violence at that level." As a matter of fact, the entire Wakarusa War, how many casualties it had?
There wasn't very many.
There was two.
Yeah.
One on each side. Even though John Brown hadn't fired a shot, he quickly made a name for himself in Kansas as the opposite of a non-resistant abolitionist, which again was very different at that point because they were still pacifists. Yeah. The thing Brown didn't understand, though, is even though the Free State Kansans wanted it free of slavery, they were not big into equality. They wanted a free state, but they wanted it to be white.
Exactly. They wanted to be the ones that were working the land, making the money off of it, not the slave
Right. This was not a progressive type group wanting to, free elections. They wanted to have, they wanted it to be white. So for the rest, and Brown never got that. For the rest of the winter, Brown and his family were cold and hungry and destitute, living in tents near their Pottawatomie Creek, living daily with rumors of Missouri ruffians coming into Kansas to kill them. Because now John Brown's got a target on his head. In early 1856, President Pierce endorsed that pro-slavery government as legitimate.
Yeah.
So now that shadow government at Topeka has been kind of pushed to the side. And he declared any resistance to them as treason and threatened to use federal troops to enforce it. Now, this was a big deal. This isn't like today calling out the National Guard.
Yeah.
There was no standing army back then. So to say federal troops are going to be called in to defend something is a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
Brown, again, was pissed. And he said the use of federal troops was, quote, a hellish enactment. But he also welcomed it because he was looking for a fight very badly at this point. A pro-slave judge, he arrived to hold court in a place called Dutch Henry Sherman's Crossing. It was called Dutch Henry's Crossing traditionally, which was a pro-slave outpost on Pottawatomie Creek. From there, the judge issued an arrest warrant for Brown for violating slave insurgency laws.
And he was proud of that, too.
He did. So what does he do? He puts the family in the car, and he drives them over, introduces them as the Pottawatomie Rifles, and they go to the courthouse and say, "I'm here, arrest me." You know what the judge does?
He doesn't even arrest. He's like, no.
He balls us out. He doesn't arrest him. He just lets him go. So he called his bluff. A few months later, in May of 56, the rumor came out that a pro-slavery group of ruffians was coming, and this time it was true. There was a lot of boy calling wolf at this point. The mayor from a town in Alabama named Jefferson Buford was leading 400 troops into Kansas under a big banner that read, quote, "the supremacy of the white race."
Wow.
They camped not far from Brown's camp at Pottawatomie Creek, but they didn't attack Brown. They were targeting the Free State city of Lawrence, Kansas. Missouri ruffians did finally come and they joined Buford to invade Lawrence. Former Missouri Senator David Atchison, he told the Southerners encamped outside of Lawrence, quote, "Draw your revolvers and cool them in the heart's blood of those damn dogs that dare defend that damn breathing hole of hell." Angry fella, you know?
Very.
Brown and his men quickly mobilized 34 men to head to Lawrence and march throughout the night. And when he got there, it was too late because Lawrence had surrendered without any resistance. Because why? Because they were non-resistors. Yep. Again, he was enraged that they didn't put up a fight, but also that he missed out. But the Free State people of Lawrence were non-resistors, like I said. They were part of that William Lloyd Garrison philosophy, so they were easy to push back. Brown sat back in his camp, and he decided that he had had enough. He decided his next move, and his son Jason overheard him say, quote, "Something must be done, and something is going to be done."
Yeah.
And Brown, he began to recruit men to join a secret mission, while his oldest son John Jr. said, "Listen, don't be too rash here. Okay?"
Yeah, his son's having to calm him down.
Because he knew he was up to something. Yeah. His other sons, Owen, Frederick, Salmon, and Oliver, along with his son-in-law Henry Thompson, who he brought, agreed to sign up for John Brown's mission. He also recruited 2 others, Thomas Weiner, a local store owner, and James Townsley, who offered to drive them in his wagon. Now, Brown was on the edge, and the slightest provocation against abolitionists was going to be the final straw, was going to set him off. That final straw came on May 22nd in Washington on the floor of the U.S. Senate.
Yep, and this was when Senator Charles Sumner is caned by Preston Brooks.
Sumner gave a speech, and he accused slave supporters of, quote, "raping virgin territory by a drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization." Mm-hmm. He also called Senator Aidan Butler of South Carolina, quote, "He has a harlot called slavery as his mistress."
Yep. And this really pissed Preston Brooks off, and he broke his cane over Sumner's head, beats him there, and Sumner's not able to return. I think he's out for 3 years.
3 full years he could, but all along, now Brooks is a celebrity in the South. Now, Salmon Brown wrote about seeing his father's and the other men's reaction to the Charles Sumner caning, and he wrote, quote, "The men went crazy. It seemed to be the finishing, decisive touch." Now, he said men, not Brown, which meant they were all set off by this. This is the moment when John Brown turned into Milton at the end of Office Space, when he finally had enough and said, quote, "I could set the building on fire."
Yep.
And they shut the lights off on him in his cubicle. This caning was the culmination of a series of events that Brown was simmering over, and this led to the cheese finally falling off of his cracker.
Yep. And what's going to happens on the night of May 24th.
Right. But before that, though, Salmon wrote that quote. This is one thing the history doesn't a lot jive with this, though, because the timing between Sumner's caning and the massacre was so close, he would need the internet to find out that quickly. Yeah. So it doesn't line up, but it does line up with the sacking of Kansas. So either way, there was a flashpoint. Southerners constantly bullying Kansans and abusing abolitionists in Washington convinced Brown that the time to act was now.
Yep.
And this is when we're going to get into this whole thing. In May 24th, about 11 p.m., it was a moonlit night. James Doyle, his wife Mahola, and their 5 children were in bed when they heard a noise from the outside. They lived in a small cabin on Mosquito Creek, which is right off Pottawatomie Creek. What would happen over the next 4 hours would be known as the Pottawatomie Massacre.
Yep. And it's very, the details of it are, we'll never know completely what happened and who did what.
Well, it came out later, a lot of them, but it's interesting because it started when a man's voice was heard outside of Doyle's house asking for directions to their neighbor. Doyle appeared at the door when a group of men burst in with guns and knives, saying that they were members of the Northern Army and they were here to take Doyle and his 3 sons prisoner.
Yep.
Now, the Doyles did not own slaves. They were a poor family from Tennessee, but James and 2 of his sons were part of that pro-slavery party and huge supporters of the Southern cause. Mahola, Doyle's wife, begged the men to leave their 16-year-old son behind. because of his age, and the men agreed to do it. Now, they didn't know the identity of the men, but they did see that, quote, an old man commanding the party, and the men talked exactly like Eastern and Northern men talk. This is according to 16-year-old John Doyle, the son who was left behind.
Yeah.
Before leaving the Doyles, they asked where their neighbor, Alan Wilkinson, lived, who was a member of the pro-slavery Kansas legislature who lived about a mile away from the Doyle cabin. It was just about midnight on the 25th when Louisa Jane Wilkinson heard a dog barking, and she woke her husband, Alan. Soon there was a big loud knock on the door, right? A voice said, quote, "Is Wilkinson an opponent of the Free State cause?" Which Wilkinson said he was. Then a voice from the outside yelled, "In that case, you are our prisoner." And then 4 armed men entered the home to take Wilkinson while his wife Louisa begged them to leave him alone. Louisa later said, quote, "An older man asked if we have neighbors," to which she said that they did. She also said the older man wore soiled clothes and had a straw hat pulled down over his face. They wanted to know where Dutch Henry Sherman lived. He was their target, as well as Wilkinson. The men took Alan Wilkinson without allowing him to put his shoes or even his socks on and dragged him out the door. They next found their way to the home of Dutch Henry Sherman, who was Dutch Henry Crossing was named after. This is where the judge had issued those warrants for their arrests earlier, as well as it was a location of a pro-slavery meeting place. Henry wasn't home. He was out looking for his lost cattle, of all things. Yeah. But one of his employees named James Harris was there with his wife and child. The men demanded Harris's surrender along with 3 other men who just happened to be staying there at their home. One of the men was Dutch Henry Sherman's brother, William. Yeah, his name was William Sherman. Obviously a different guy.
Yeah.
He would have burned the place down. But all the men were questioned, and in the end, only William Sherman was taken by the men.
Yep.
15 or so minutes later, James Harris reported hearing a gunshot. This is around 3 o'clock in the morning. This gunshot woke up the locals near Pottawatomie, as did the overall sound of the commotion of men running around, but none left their homes until the sun came up a few hours later because they were scared to death what the hell was going on. When dawn did break, what the locals discovered was basically a scene right out of hell. Near the first stop of the Doyle home, about 200 yards away, 16-year-old John Doyle, the son who was left behind, found the bodies of his father, James, and his 2 brothers, William and Drury. James had a single shot in his forehead, and his chest was slashed open. William's head was cut open, and his jaw was slashed. 22-year-old Drury had his fingers cut off, his head slashed open, and a gash across his chest. Down the creek, locals approached the Wilkinson cabin to find Louisa in tears, who had just heard about what happened to the Doyles and was scared to go outside, fearing the worst.
Yep.
Wilkinson's body was found in a bush about 100 yards from his cabin. His throat had been slashed and his head split open. At Dutch Henry's Crossing, James Harris went outside to look for William Sherman and found him floating in a creek with his head split open and his brains washing out of his head into the stream.
Ugh.
One of Sherman's hands was also cut off. And this came out later, but all the men were executed with broadswords, and the hand injuries appear to be defensive injuries as they try to protect themselves. Now, this news of this Pottawatomie Massacre spread like wildfire. John Brown and his men were back at camp where his son Jason, who stayed behind, asked his father, "Did you do this? Were you part of this?" And he said, quote, "I did not, but I approved of it. God is my judge, and we were justified under the circumstances."
So he's basically saying
he ordered it.
Yeah.
He made the sons do it. Now, John Brown never spoke directly of the massacre, only alluding to it and speaking vaguely about it. But years later, that wagon driver, James Townsley, he confessed to his part of the massacre. He said the swords were used because they were quiet. And the gunshot heard that was fired into John Doyle's head by Brown, he said Doyle was already dead, but the gunshot was fired as a signal to the others it was time to move on to the next target. Instead of firing in the sky, he shot into his head.
Oh my God.
Now, he said Brown, basically did this to send a message. The Pottawatomie Massacre also sent shockwaves into the north as well. Now, Lawrence sacking and Sumner's caning may have been the final straw for Brown, but for Garrison and that Boston clique, They wanted no part of the violence. They still
No.
didn't. John Brown Jr. later wrote, those slain in such a manner was done as to be likely to cause a fear. And this was really, he was basically saying that the killings were a message to the pro-slavery camp that future violence on free settlers would be met with similar retaliation.
Yep.
And really was a warning to the ruffians and the pro-slavery supporters. Louisa Wilkinson fled Kansas, as did the rest of the Doyle family. But that Pottawatomie Massacre succeeded in spreading terror, which, although historians disagree, was probably Brown's true motive, right? A local settler in Pottawatomie, who moved from South Carolina there, wrote his sister after the massacre, quote, I never lay down without having my rifle, revolver, and old homemade pistol where I can lay my hands on them in an instant. Abolitionists never make an attack in daylight. Now, newspapers in Missouri, they reported on the massacre, which generated, again, a lot of anger. Now, Pottawatomie's death total was almost double the death totals in Kansas up to that point, including the Wakarusa War. But John Brown threw gas on the fire and eventually got the violent response he wanted. Selman Brown, his son, wrote of it later, quote, we wanted to hurry up the fight. We merely struck to begin the fight that we saw was being forced upon us. So again, if this was Brown's true intention, it definitely worked, because the killings eventually escalated dramatically in the month that followed, earning the territory the nickname of Bloody Kansas.
Yep. Like you have engagements like Battle of Blackjack, Battle of Pottawatomie as well, which Brown is apparently involved in, and all this stuff. And it's just, again, talking about this is an event. This massacre is something that it's part of the history of the American Civil War, even though it happens, 5 years before it starts?
I mean, exactly. But you know what's so funny was, even if this was all going, the pro-slavery posse, as you can imagine, began to hunt for John Brown pretty quickly and his sons. John Jr. had a mental breakdown after this.
Yeah.
And he was caught pretty quickly because he literally had lost his mind.
Yeah.
He was imprisoned for 3 months on a treason charge. The posse burned the Browns' dwelling and drove off their livestock. The women in Brown's camp hid out in a cabin owned by the Browns' half-sister Florella, who was very disapproval of the killings as well. But what did Browns do? Brown and his remaining sons and his army went deep into the woods in eastern Kansas and went into hiding. And here's the thing that's amazing about this is, while deep in the woods, he decided to launch a PR campaign. And he invited a news correspondent named James Redpath. He was a writer for an anti-slavery newspaper, to talk about his decision to basically walk away from pacifism. Redpath said of Brown, quote, Brown is a selfless freedom fighter acting in obedience to the will of the Lord. I've seen the pedestrian leader of the second and holier American Revolution. And this was the message John Brown wanted told. This was it. He saw himself as, in his existence, as being sent from God to rid the country of the sin of slavery. He said, quote, God sees it, I will die fighting for this cause, and I will carry the war into Africa, like you said.
Yeah.
His nickname for the slaveholding South, specifically Virginia. And like you said a few minutes ago, he'd fight again in August of 1856 at the Battle of Pottawatomie, which was a free state community that was attacked by pro-slavery men, where he led about 40 guys. This is where he'll earn the nickname Pottawatomie Brown.
Yeah.
But it's amazingly, in 1857, what's Brown going to do? He's going to return back to Boston. And he would again have a heated argument with William Lloyd Garrison over violence versus pacifism. If you Google John Brown's picture, there's a picture of him taken by a guy named James Black, who's a famous Boston photographer that hangs today in Washington, D.C.'s National Portrait Gallery. This is the one with the long beard and his hands in his pocket. This is post-Pottawatomie. With the taste of blood finally in his mouth and feeling his actions were justified by God, John Brown began to think of his next move, which would culminate on the attack on the army at Harper's Ferry. But again, the Pottawatomie Massacre was a culmination of a series of events which chipped away at Brown's mind, and each event made him more radical.
Yeah.
You know, and there are some who say, who study him, they think he's insane. But I mean, but others, like author, a guy named Robert McClone, he wrote a book called John Brown's War Against Slavery. He doesn't feel that. He felt that all of his actions were calculated. And having James Redpath come to tell his story is not the move of an insane man. That's someone who's calculating. And so, like many parts, the darkest parts of history, the truth is always going to be in the eye of the beholder with these things.
Yeah. Yep. And however you feel about John Brown, he is a figure that needs to be studied when it comes to the American Civil War. And I think probably closer to the anniversary of the raid on Harper's Ferry, we'll probably do an episode about that to continue this story of him, because again, and it's a story, the raid at Harper's Ferry. It also involves Lee and Jeb Stuart. So you have these figures that are going to be fighting a couple years later in the American Civil War.
No, when people think of the Civil War, they think of,
Sumter.
They think of secession. They think of Lincoln being elected as what set it off. This had been started a long time earlier. And like I said before, you can really trace the annexation of Texas as really sort of the beginning of the modern part of the 1800s leading to the war. But every step along the way, you had someone like John Brown, who was going further and further away from that pacifist Garrisonian theory to develop his own theory, who already had religion in his head, based on his father Owen. And he felt that he was the chosen one to end slavery, which he considered a sin. So you can see how all these events happen. It's all cause and effect. And like we said before, no one's praising him, no one's condemning him. It's always the eye of the beholder, but it's tough to deny the significance of someone like him, which did ultimately create the American Civil War.
Yeah, 100% agree.
So what's up for us next?
Well, we have to sit down at the old headquarters and decide what our next episodes are going to be.
Yeah, but before that, Mary, we're on to Christmas, though.
We are on to Christmas. So we hope all of you have a very Merry Christmas, happy holidays, whatever you celebrate, and a very happy New Year. Our next episode will drop in 2026, likely.
And that'll be year 6 for the calendar.
Yep.
Time flies.
Yep.
Time flies. I'm getting yelled at. That's pretty good.
Yelling at you.
All right. So everybody have a great Christmas. Have a great holiday season. Have a happy and safe New Year. And we will see you all on the other side.
See y'all later.
Peace out.
Bye.